There are places in the woods where even the bravest dare not tread. For years, whispers have swirled around eerie encounters of people who vanished without a trace, leaving nothing but fear in their wake. Something massive, something powerful, is said to roam these forgotten corners of the earth. Eyes in the darkness, footsteps that echo too loudly. These aren't just stories, they're warnings. What happens when curiosity leads you into the heart of the unknown? Sometimes you don't walk out. The Smoky Mountains, with their towering trees and misty ridges, have long been a place of beauty and mystery. But in July 1994, 4 teenage friends discovered a darker side of the wilderness, one that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. What was supposed to be a carefree camping trip turned into a nightmare that would forever change their world. The friends, Luther, Clark, Belle, and Dolly, had always loved the outdoors. They'd grown up hiking and camping, dreaming of more adventurous trips. So when they decided on the Smoky Mountains for a weekend getaway, they felt excited and invincible. The mountains had always been peaceful, a place to escape their everyday worries and be together. The first day went smoothly. They set up camp by a small creek, made a fire, and spent the evening roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. As night fell, a cool breeze rustled through the trees. At first it was calming, but soon the rustling grew louder. "Probably just some raccoons or squirrels," Luther said, shrugging. Clark nodded, but Belle and Dolly exchanged uneasy glances. They'd heard something larger than a squirrel, something with purpose, but didn't want to spoil the mood. As the night wore on, the sounds continued, growing louder. Every so often, something would crash through the underbrush, but nothing came into view. Even Luther, the skeptic, began to feel uneasy. Still, they laughed it off, attributing it to typical woods noises. But as the night deepened, so did the noise. It was deliberate now, like something, or someone, was circling them, watching. Luther stood up, straining to see through the darkness. "I'll go check it out," he said, grabbing a flashlight. The others watched him, unsure of whether to be concerned. The forest seemed to press in around them. Luther returned, his face pale. "Something's out there," he said, his voice tense. "It's big, really big." The group fell silent, listening. The rustling was closer now, louder, more urgent. They all felt it. Something wasn't right. "We need to stay close," Dolly whispered, her voice trembling. They huddled together by the fire, hearts pounding. The second night brought a terrifying turn. A storm rolled in quickly, the wind howling and rain pouring down in sheets. They were in their tents trying to sleep when a deafening roar echoed through the woods. It was unlike anything they had ever heard. A growl mixed with a scream, primal and terrifying. The ground vibrated with its force. The teens froze in fear, unable to move or speak. Then came the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, the ground shaking with each thud. Clark, trembling, unzipped his tent. In the storm's dim light, he saw something that froze his blood. A massive figure, nearly 9 feet tall, covered in dark fur, its eyes glowing with unnatural intelligence. "Get to the car!" Luther shouted, his voice panicked. The teens scrambled to their feet, grabbing what they could as they rushed to escape, but they weren't fast enough. The creature lunged, its large hands tearing through the tents like paper. Dolly screamed, barely ducking as one of its massive arms swiped where she had been moments before. Belle tripped and fell to the ground. Luther and Clark ran into the woods, while Belle and Dolly dashed toward the car, hearts racing. But they didn't make it far. The creature was relentless, moving with terrifying speed. Its roar filled the air. Belle reached the car first, fumbling with the keys, hands shaking. Dolly was right behind her, but as she turned to the car, the creature grabbed her, lifting her effortlessly into the air. "Dolly!" Belle screamed, but there was nothing she could do. The creature's grip was like iron. It swung Dolly away into the dark woods. The last thing Belle saw before she got in the car was the creature's glowing eyes, watching from the shadows. Clark had twisted his ankle and Luther had bruises from running into a tree. But they didn't stop to assess their injuries. They were too terrified, too aware that the creature was still out there. The storm raged on, but they didn't look back. They managed to start the car, the engine sputtering to life as thunder cracked overhead. They sped down the winding road, hearts still racing. But no matter how fast they drove, the terror of what they'd seen would never leave them. The next morning, after the storm had passed, they returned to the campsite. What they found made their blood run cold. Huge footprints, over 20 inches long, were deeply imprinted in the earth. The ground around the tents was torn apart, as if a massive creature had stomped through it. Among the wreckage were the shredded remains of their belongings, torn clothes, mangled tents, and one of Dolly's shoes, unrecognizable. Local authorities were called in, but their explanation was unsatisfying. The sheriff initially blamed a bear. "Must have been a bear," he said. "There's no other explanation." But the teens knew better. They'd seen the creature. It was no bear. Bears didn't walk on two legs and didn't have the strength to rip through tents and toss people around. Despite the sheriff's reassurances, the teens knew something wasn't over. They couldn't explain it, but the creature was still out there, watching, waiting. The investigation quickly fizzled out, and the teens never returned to the Smoky Mountains. In the years that followed, they tried to put the events behind them, but the nightmares never stopped. They couldn't forget the monstrous figure, the terror of hearing it draw closer, and the feeling that it was still out there. The Smoky Mountains remained as beautiful as ever, but for Luther, Clark, Belle, and Dolly, it was forever tainted by the terror they'd experienced. Deep within the shadows of those misty hills, something still watched, waiting for the next soul to cross its path. Lisa McAllister took pride in maintaining her ranch near the crazy mountains in Montana. For years, she'd worked hard to ensure her cattle were healthy, her fences intact, and her pastures in prime condition. The rugged land was her sanctuary, a place she knew like the back of her hand. On the morning of August 9th, 1965, Lisa noticed something was wrong. She'd woken before dawn as usual to start her chores. As she approached the barn, she saw that 3 of her best steers were missing, and the pasture was disturbed. The fence had been damaged. Deep gouges marked the wood, twisted as though something massive had tried to force its way through. Her heart raced. Wolves? Maybe. But Lisa knew wolves didn't behave like this. This was something much bigger. As the sun rose, she inspected the area further. There was no sign of blood or typical predator tracks, but she found something else. Footprints. Huge, muddy prints, much larger and deeper than anything she'd seen before. Lisa, familiar with animal tracks, recognized these as something out of the ordinary. That night, determined to uncover the creature responsible, Lisa stayed up, rifle in hand, near the pasture. The wind picked up, and the usual sounds of the night gave way to an unsettling stillness. Then a bone-chilling wail echoed through the trees. No coyote or wolf's howl, but something far more sinister. Lisa froze, her grip tightening on her rifle as she scanned the darkness. From the trees, a massive, shaggy silhouette emerged, moving slowly toward her herd. It was tall, much taller than any man, and its long, matted fur absorbed the moonlight. Lisa's heart pounded. She didn't know what it was, but it was unlike anything she'd ever seen. She steadied her rifle, took a deep breath, and fired. The shot rang out, but the creature didn't flinch. It paused, its glowing eyes locking onto Lisa for a brief moment before it vanished into the woods, leaving only the sound of the wind in its wake. Lisa sat stunned, hands shaking as she lowered her rifle. What had she just witnessed? A bear? No, this was far too large, too swift. She realized she'd seen something extraordinary, a living legend. Over the next few days, unease continued to gnaw at her. The missing cattle weighed heavily on her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, lurking just beyond the trees. Then she found more damage. Her fences had been torn apart again, bigger holes, wider gaps, and this time there were fresh, deeper tracks. Her heart sank. Whatever had attacked her cattle wasn't finished yet. Lisa contacted local authorities, but the sheriff dismissed her concerns. "Must be wolves," he said, shrugging. "Maybe a mountain lion." His indifference mirrored the town's response. Lisa's reports were met with polite nods and blank stares. Undeterred, Lisa spent the next few nights camping out near her herd, rifle in hand. Each night, she waited, nerves on edge. It wasn't until the 4th night that she saw the creature again. This time it stepped fully into view, its massive form barely visible in the moonlight. Lisa fired another shot, but once again the creature reacted too quickly. It ducked into the trees, vanishing before she could get a clear shot. She lowered her rifle with a sigh, knowing deep down that she wasn't dealing with just any animal. This was something far older, something that had been hiding in the wilderness for centuries. The following day, Lisa found more evidence. Her cattle were spooked, and there were strange marks on the ground, deep gouges and scrapes too wide for any normal animal. Even the cattle avoided certain areas of the pasture, as though they sensed the danger. But when Lisa reported this to the sheriff again, he dismissed her concerns. "Could be a bear, could be anything," he said. Nothing unusual about that. Lisa knew better. She had seen it for herself. She had encountered something legendary, something real. The creature was out there, somewhere in the mountains, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Lisa never saw the creature again, though strange events continued to occur. The missing cattle were never recovered, and the mystery of what had attacked them remained unsolved. Whether it was a bear, a wolf, or something else entirely, Lisa knew she'd never forget what she had seen in the crazy mountains. The ranch, though still standing, was never quite the same. Lisa continued her work, but she always kept a watchful eye on the tree line, waiting for the creature to return. And deep in the shadows of the crazy mountains, the beast remained, hidden among the trees, waiting for its next encounter. Caleb Rayner had always dreamed of becoming a wildlife photographer. The beauty of nature, the quiet moments, and the thrill of capturing them on film, there was nothing more he loved. So when he found himself in Northern California's dense redwood forests, he felt like he was in paradise. The towering trees, thick with fog, were the perfect backdrop for the photos he longed to take. And that morning, he had his sights set on something rare, a deer herd that he hoped would wander into his viewfinder at dawn. The first few hours were peaceful. Caleb hiked through the underbrush, setting up his camera trap at a perfect vantage point where he believed the deer would appear. He positioned the camera and double-checked the settings, ensuring everything was ready. As he waited, a strange quiet settled over the forest. But then, just as the sun began to rise, he heard something unusual: low grunts, the snap of a branch. At first, Caleb thought it was a deer, a buck perhaps, or even a bear, but there was something unsettling about it. The noise was getting closer. Curiosity and a bit of nervous excitement took over. Caleb grabbed his camera and crept forward, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever animal was nearby. The grunting continued, growing louder, followed by the heavy sound of something large moving through the forest. Caleb held his breath and slowly reached the edge of a thick patch of trees, trying to stay hidden. But then, just as he was about to peer around the trunk of a massive redwood, he heard a loud crack of wood. Something was big, too big, moving through the trees. He froze. His heart pounded in his chest as he waited, but the moment stretched on without any more noise. Caleb took one cautious step back, his eyes scanning the shadows, but there was nothing. His camera trap, however, had captured something. Later, sitting in his tent and reviewing the footage, Caleb's stomach dropped. The footage was blurry, but clear enough to make out a large, shadowy figure, far larger than any bear or elk, moving through the trees. Its outline was vague, but the size was undeniable. Caleb's fingers trembled as he zoomed in, trying to make sense of the image, but the shape vanished into the forest before any more details could be captured. What was that? Intrigued but skeptical, Caleb decided to return in the afternoon. There was something about the figure that drew him in, a sense of mystery he couldn't ignore. He knew he had to go back. He had to get clearer evidence. But when he arrived at the same spot, his stomach sank even deeper. His camera, the one he'd set up just hours earlier, was destroyed. The frame was bent, the lens shattered. It was as if something had smashed it with enormous force. The ground around the trap was torn up, large footprints embedded in the freshly softened mud. Each one was at least 2 feet long, and the depth of the prints suggested an immense weight. Caleb's breath caught in his throat as he crouched down to examine them. There was no denying it. These weren't from any animal he knew. As dusk approached, Caleb's mind raced. He knew he had to get closer. He couldn't just leave with the memories of blurry footage and broken equipment. He needed more. Something told him that if he returned tonight, he might finally get the proof he was after. With his camera in hand and a heart pounding from both anticipation and fear, Caleb found a safe vantage point in the shadows of the trees. He was shaking, but he tried to steady his hands as he waited. The sky dimmed further, and the forest grew eerily quiet again, almost as though it was holding its breath. Time seemed to stretch for hours. Then, just as the last sliver of light faded from the sky, Caleb saw it, a massive figure, outlined against the dimming trees. Its movement was slow but deliberate, as though it was aware of Caleb's presence but unconcerned. The creature was tall, at least 8 feet, and covered in thick, matted fur. The way it moved was unnatural, jerky, yet powerful. Its massive arms hung at its sides, its fingers twitching as if it were searching for something. Caleb's heart thudded in his chest, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the sight. He raised his camera, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely focus. Every click of the shutter felt like an eternity. The creature's head snapped toward him, And in that moment, Caleb's blood ran cold. Two eyes, large, dark, and reflecting the fading light, locked with his. The creature didn't move for a moment. It just stared at him. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. The creature took a step forward, its massive foot pressing into the ground with a heavy thud. The sound echoed through the woods, and Caleb stumbled back in alarm. That was enough. He couldn't stay any longer. His camera, his proof, it didn't matter. He had to escape. In a blind panic, Caleb turned and sprinted into the dense trees, his heart racing as the sound of footsteps thundered behind him. He could hear the creature moving, its breath ragged and heavy, but he dared not look back. The underbrush whipped at his legs and he stumbled over roots and rocks. It felt like the forest itself was trying to stop him, to keep him from escaping. Then, as he rounded a corner, he nearly collided with a massive log. It had fallen across the path, and in the dim light, Caleb couldn't tell if it was an obstacle or something more sinister. He didn't have time to check. His legs burned as he pushed himself harder, forcing his way through the trees. He had to get back to his car. Suddenly, he heard a growl, a deep guttural sound that shook the very air around him. The creature was close, too close. Caleb could feel the heat of its breath, and he knew that if he didn't get away soon, he might not make it out at all. The sound of heavy footsteps came closer, each one sending a wave of fear through his body. Finally, with everything he had left, Caleb reached the edge of the woods. He burst into the open clearing and made a desperate dash for his car, leaving his camera, his gear, and his evidence behind. The last thing he heard before he slammed the door shut was the creature's growl lingering in the darkness. Shaking and drenched in sweat, Caleb started the car and sped away, never once looking back. The forest behind him was silent again, but Caleb knew, deep in his bones, that something still watched from the shadows, and it was waiting. Tom Kincaid and his teenage son Andy had always shared a love for the outdoors. For years, they had talked about taking a trip together, just the two of them, to get away from the world and enjoy the peace of nature. They finally found the perfect spot, a remote campsite deep in the Oregon woods, nestled near a slow-moving river. It was the kind of place where no one went unless they were looking for solitude, which suited them just fine. With a weekend of fishing and quiet time ahead, they set up their camp under the towering trees, feeling the weight of the world lift off their shoulders. The first evening passed in quiet contentment. The fire crackled, the river babbled gently beside them, and the only sounds they heard were the calls of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. After dinner, the two of them settled by the water to clean their catch, the fish glistening in the fading light. As they worked, Tom couldn't help but think how perfect everything seemed. But that peaceful moment wouldn't last. Suddenly, a noise sliced through the air, a loud, deep roar, a sound that neither of them had ever heard before. It sent a chill through their bones, freezing them both in place. The roar echoed through the trees, and then there was a sound of branches snapping, followed by the unmistakable sound of something massive crashing through the underbrush. Tom's heart skipped a beat. He and Andy exchanged a look of confusion and fear. What could make a sound like that? Before they could react, the forest around them seemed to explode. A massive, hairy figure surged out of the trees, moving faster than anything of that size should have been able to move. It was towering, its broad shoulders blocking the last of the light from the setting sun. Its eyes glowed with a fierce intensity, and its mouth was open in what could only be described as a snarl. The creature was covered in thick, matted fur, dark and unkempt, and its hands were enormous, clawed and ready to strike. The force of its presence was overwhelming. Tom reacted instinctively. He grabbed the lantern beside him and swung it wildly in front of them. The light flickered, casting long, eerie shadows over the creature's form. In that moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. The creature's gaze fixed on them, its eyes locked with Tom's, and then it moved forward with terrifying speed. The lantern crashed to the ground, the fire sputtering out, but the light wasn't needed anymore. The creature was already close enough to reach out. It was too fast. Before either of them could react further, the beast reached forward, its massive hands knocking over their cooler, scattering their gear in every direction. Tom stumbled back, pulling Andy with him as the creature growled low, its breath hot and heavy. It was clear that this was no wild animal. This was something much worse, something powerful, something otherworldly. The creature didn't seem to care about their lives. It was only interested in what it could take. It seized the cooler with one hand, and in a move so swift that it left Tom dizzy, it turned and fled into the trees, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They just stared into the dark, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he pulled his son close. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Now." Without hesitation, they gathered what little gear they could salvage. But their nerves were frazzled. The creature had moved so quickly, so unexpectedly. It was almost as if it knew they were there, like it had been watching them from the shadows. Tom tried to keep his head, but fear kept creeping in. He had no idea what that creature was or what it wanted, but he knew one thing for sure. It was not going to let them just walk away. As they hurried to break camp, Tom's mind raced. How could they leave? They were miles away from civilization and the sun was almost gone. It was dangerous to travel at night in these woods, but staying at the campsite wasn't an option either. Something about the creature's behavior felt deliberate, almost predatory. The shadows in the forest seemed to grow deeper as night fell, and the wind rustled the trees in an unsettling way. Tom felt a creeping sense of being watched. He grabbed his flashlight, scanning the trees around them, but saw nothing. Just the endless rows of towering trees and the pitch-black expanse beyond. Then, without warning, another roar broke the silence. It was closer this time. Tom froze, his grip tightening on Andy's arm. They were not alone. "We have to move," Tom urged, his voice barely a whisper. But Andy, wide-eyed, couldn't move. He was frozen, staring into the dark like a deer caught in headlights. Then they heard it. The creature, whatever it was coming closer. The ground shook with each step. The air smelled different now, thick with the scent of wet earth and something else. Something primal. Tom turned and grabbed Andy by the shoulder. "We run now!" he shouted, and without another word, they bolted, crashing through the trees, doing their best to avoid falling over roots and branches. Behind them, the sound of heavy footsteps followed. Too close, too fast. It felt like hours before they finally reached the edge of the woods, breathless and terrified. Tom stopped, glancing back into the trees, but there was nothing. No creature, no sound, just the wind. They didn't stop to catch their breath. They made their way as quickly as possible back to their car, their hearts still pounding in their chests. They didn't speak until they were finally on the road, heading back home, the safety of their car offering some comfort. The woods, the river, the creature, they were all behind them now. But the images remained, burned into their memories. Neither Tom nor Andy would ever speak of it again, not in detail. They both knew what they had seen, and they knew it was something that should never have been. Though they left the forest that night, a part of them still wondered. What had they encountered? What had taken their cooler? And what did it want? As they drove into the night, the weight of the unanswered questions pressed down on them. But there was one thing they both knew for sure. They would never go back. Not to that forest. Not to those woods, because what had stalked them through the trees was something they would never forget, something that was still out there, watching, waiting. Late one autumn, Mark and Linda Pearson decided to hike off the beaten path in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. They had planned a weekend getaway to enjoy the rugged beauty of the Rockies and to find some of the unique rock formations that the area was known for. The pair had been hiking for hours, and the landscape, as always, took their breath away. A sense of peace settled over them, with only the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. Their hike led them away from the well-traveled paths. As they ventured deeper into the mountains, they noticed something unusual. A narrow cave entrance, barely visible among the overgrown foliage. Curiosity piqued, they decided to explore it. The cave was dark and smelled strangely foul, like something rotting. Linda, always more cautious than Mark, hesitated. She pointed out the scattered animal bones near the entrance, evidence that this place had been used by some creature. But Mark reassured her that it was just the remnants of some wild animal, nothing to be afraid of. Still, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The cave was tight, its passage narrow and winding. They crawled further inside, the air growing thick and damp. Mark had a flashlight and its beam cut through the darkness, illuminating jagged rocks and damp walls. Every so often, they'd come across more bones, small scattered remains of creatures they couldn't identify, but neither of them said it aloud. The cave had an oppressive feeling to it, as if it were a place meant to keep secrets. They pressed on, their excitement at the discovery outweighing their growing unease. Suddenly, a heavy sound interrupted the silence. A loud thud, followed by a series of deep, crunching footsteps. The earth trembled beneath them as the noise grew closer. Mark froze, his flashlight flickering nervously. It wasn't the scurrying of a small animal. This was something big, too big. Linda's heart began to race. They could both hear the sound now, unmistakable. The heavy footfalls of something large, moving quickly. Mark turned to look at her, panic in his eyes. And before they could even process the situation, a low growl echoed from the entrance of the cave. The sound was primal, chilling, like the growl of something that didn't belong in this world. It shook Linda to her core. Without thinking, Mark grabbed Linda's arm and pulled her deeper into the cave. Their breaths quickened as they scrambled to find a place to hide, but the cave offered little comfort. The growl came again, louder this time. Something massive was just outside, its steps thunderous and powerful. Mark and Linda had nowhere to go but farther into the darkness, desperate to escape whatever was coming. Then, the creature appeared. The cave entrance filled with a towering shadow, blocking out the little light that filtered in from outside. It was immense. Even from their hidden position deep in the cave, they could feel the presence of something huge, standing just beyond the mouth of the tunnel. The creature moved slowly, cautiously, ducking its head to enter the narrow cave. Linda's breath caught in her throat as she realized the size of it. It was covered in thick matted fur, its body hulking and broad. Its face, though partially hidden in shadow, had features that were unmistakable. Wide-set eyes, a broad nose, and a terrifyingly large mouth. Panic swept over them. Mark's mind raced. He knew that whatever it wasn't a bear. It was far too big, its presence almost human-like but twisted in a way that defied logic. It was a creature of the wilderness, an animal they had only heard about in stories. The legendary Sasquatch. Mark's mind began to work fast, calculating their options. He quickly reached into his backpack and pulled out a flare. There was no time to waste. He pulled the tab and tossed the flare into the air, watching as it sparked to life, lighting up the cave for just a moment. The flare illuminated the creature's face, revealing its grim expression. It was a terrifying sight. Its eyes were dark, deeply set into its skull, and its wide, flat nose flared as it inhaled deeply, as though scenting the air for them. Its growl was guttural, vibrating the very walls of the cave. The creature's massive hands gripped the cave entrance, and it seemed to pause, sensing something out of place. Linda's heart hammered in her chest, and she squeezed Mark's arm, silently pleading for him to think of something, anything, that could get them out of this nightmare. The flare burned out, leaving them in near-complete darkness once again. The creature's growls grew more urgent, and with a sudden motion it lunged into the cave, its massive form crashing against the walls. Mark and Linda scrambled back, their feet slipping on the damp rock, but there was nowhere to go. They were trapped. The creature moved toward them, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. It was so close now that Linda could feel the heat radiating from its body. She could hear its ragged breathing, and she could see its form hunched over, massive arms hanging loosely at its sides, fingers long and thick. Its face, if it could even be called that, was twisted with a look of pure instinct, like an animal that had been disturbed in its domain. Linda's throat went dry as the creature's dark eyes locked with hers, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still. It wasn't afraid of them. It was the hunter, and they were the prey. Mark grabbed her hand, his grip tight, and tugged her toward a tight crevice in the cave's wall. They had to squeeze through it, barely able to breathe in the confined space. Mark shoved Linda ahead of him, pushing her through the narrow gap. She barely fit, her shoulders scraping against the rock, but she finally made it through. Mark followed, barely squeezing his body through the tight opening. They didn't dare look back, they just ran. The sounds of the creature's footsteps grew fainter as they pressed through the cave, their panic and fear fueling their escape. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they emerged from the cave into the open mountain air. They could hear the creature's growls echoing behind them, but they didn't stop. They kept running until the sounds faded completely. When they finally stopped, breathless and trembling, Mark and Linda looked at each other, wide-eyed and shaken. They both knew without speaking that they had crossed into territory where they didn't belong. They had entered a place where something far older, far more dangerous, lurked in the shadows. They had encountered something no one could explain, something they would never forget. They left the mountains that day. Their peaceful hike turned nightmare forever burned into their memories. And as they looked back at the peaks of the San Juan Mountains, They both wondered just how many more hidden caves held secrets like the one they'd found. Dana Brooks and Eric Walsh were investigative journalists who had spent years covering strange and unusual stories, but nothing could have prepared them for the events they would experience on a trip to northern Minnesota in the fall. The area had seen a rising number of Bigfoot sightings, and both Dana and Eric were eager to uncover the truth behind the reports. The two of them traveled deep into the woods, far from the nearest town. They spent their days interviewing locals, cabin owners, hunters, and hikers, each one sharing eerie stories of strange howls echoing through the forest at dawn and unusual footprints found near remote cabins. It was clear that something was out there, and it was no bear. On the third evening of their trip, Dana and Eric decided to camp near a clearing surrounded by dense trees. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the landscape. They set up their tents and started a small campfire, hoping the flickering flames would keep away any unwanted animals. It was a peaceful night, but there was a constant feeling in the air, a subtle tension that neither of them could shake off. They both knew the stories they had heard were far from comforting. As the night deepened, the forest around them grew quieter. It was almost as if the world had paused. Then, suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of snapping branches. Dana stiffened, her hand instinctively gripping the flashlight she kept beside her. Eric was already standing, scanning the shadows with his eyes. The sound of labored breathing reached their ears, deep, slow, and heavy. For a moment, neither of them moved. Dana's heart was pounding in her chest as the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, a shadow moved through the trees, and a massive shape stepped into the clearing. Dana froze, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The creature that stood before them was taller than anything she could have imagined. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, and its height seemed to stretch into the trees above. Its face was almost human-like, with deep-set eyes that reflected the moonlight. The creature's massive form towered over them. Its broad shoulders hunched forward, and its arms hung low, nearly touching the ground. It was a creature unlike anything she had ever seen. Eric, more experienced with such encounters, pulled out his camera and managed to snap a single photograph. The flash illuminated the beast's grim features for a split second. It was enough to confirm what they both feared. They were looking at a Bigfoot. The creature's head snapped toward them. Its gaze was intense, locking onto them as if it knew they were intruders. Then, without warning, the creature made a deep, guttural growl that echoed through the clearing. It took a step forward, its heavy footfalls vibrating the ground beneath them. Dana felt her legs go numb with terror, but Eric's instincts kicked in. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Dana's arm. They didn't need to be told twice. Dropping their equipment in their haste, the two journalists turned and sprinted into the woods, their only thoughts being to put as much distance between themselves and the creature as possible. The sounds of heavy footsteps followed them, thundering behind them like a force of nature. The ground trembled with each step the creature took. Dana's breath was ragged, the cold night air burning in her lungs. She could hear the creature's labored breathing just behind them, closer now, almost like it was toying with them. Branches and leaves cracked underfoot as they pushed through the dense forest. Behind them, the creature's growls grew louder, its presence closing in on them. Dana glanced back, and through the trees, she saw the hulking silhouette of the creature, its eyes still fixed on them, glowing eerily in the darkness. Every step felt like an eternity. They were running blindly now, too scared to think clearly, but they knew they couldn't stop. There was no telling what would happen if they did. Dana's legs burned. Her body screamed for rest, but the fear kept her moving. Finally, after what felt like forever, they spotted a small break in the trees, an opening with a thick rock formation jutting out. Without a word, Eric veered toward it, pulling Dana along with him. The rocks offered some form of shelter, but they both knew they weren't safe yet. The creature was still out there. Panting heavily, they took cover behind the rocks, pressing their backs against the cold stone. The world around them was unnervingly still. Dana's hands were shaking as she clutched the camera, the only evidence they had of what had just happened. They both waited, listening intently. The sound of footsteps was gone, replaced by the eerie quiet of the forest. It felt like an eternity before Eric whispered, "Do you think it's gone?" Dana didn't answer. She wasn't sure. Her mind was still reeling from the terror they had just experienced. Was it possible that the creature had just been curious, or had it seen them as a threat? Either way, they were no longer in control of the situation. They were at the mercy of something far greater than them. Then, just as the tension began to ease, a loud snap of a branch broke the silence. The creature wasn't gone. It was still out there, watching them, waiting. Dana and Eric exchanged a glance, realizing there was no time to waste. They had to move. With quick, careful steps, they crept away from the rocks, keeping as quiet as possible. Every sound felt amplified, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sending waves of panic through them. They didn't look back again. They just kept running. By the time they finally made it to a nearby road and flagged down a car, they were both exhausted and shaken to their core. They had barely escaped with their lives. Back in their quiet newsroom days later, Dana and Eric sat down to review the photograph. It was blurry but clear enough to show the massive form of the creature looming over them. The evidence they had, although small, was undeniable. Yet, as the days passed, doubt began to settle in. Their editors asked questions, and the authorities wanted more evidence, but the truth was simple. What they had seen in the forest was real, and it wasn't anything they could explain away. For Dana and Eric, their newsroom had never felt so far removed from the reality they had just experienced in northern Minnesota. And no matter how much they tried to make sense of it, they knew one thing for certain. Bigfoot was out there, hidden, watching, waiting,